Hello.
I think somebody's supposed to be talking here.
Yeah, finally hearing somebody.
Well, hi, everybody. I can hear you guys. I was waiting for maybe Robbie to see if we were going to be able to do a share screen here, or we have control of that already to go.
Yeah, so everyone in
The thing was down there, but they said it'd be.
everyone in the policy forum should be a co-host and should be able to share their screen. I don't know who wants to kick it off. Right now, you should be able to see the title slide for this section of the forum. So whenever anybody's ready to take it away, then I'm happy to cede. It looks like Jill, you just took it over. That's great.
That worked. That's perfect.
Excellent.
Great. I know you guys have had some technology challenges. I'm glad we maybe worked those gremlins out already. Well,
That's
yeah, I think let's hope. It's nice to see that there's 337 participants here. Just a reminder, because I get some feedback, if you could turn your microphones on to mute while we're presenting, that would be really helpful. I'm not sure if you can control that, Robbie, on your end or not, but okay, thank you. All right, well, we have a packed agenda here today, so I'm going to get us started and make sure that we have enough time for all the really interesting facets of this conversation. I would just like to say a big shout out to the researchers that spoke ahead of us. That was like a day back in graduate school, so I loved it. My name is Jill Hoffman. I'm the Executive Director for the White River Alliance, and I'm going to kick us off today. I've got a slide up here to just kind of tell you where we're headed. There are a lot of ways for you to interact with us, the chat and the Slack, and so we want to hear from you guys as well. So we hope that this little 1 hour session gives you some insight into how our wetlands are regulated, gives you a real life project example, and then talks a little bit about how we can move forward in a constructive way in regard to policy. So I'm up first. I've got about 10 minutes to give you guys what a lot of people spend years in school trying to figure out, and that's what is a wetland and how are we regulating that. So call this a quick and dirty wetlands primer. I would like to remind you that if you have interest in these kinds of topics, our organization does host the Indiana Water Summit. And that summit has a number of policy forums and a day-long event in which we try to take on really important water management issues, including wetland and floodplain protection. So if you want to learn more, there's always more for you. Okay, up first, let's just start with a quick definition. If you were on the session before, you probably got an even more scientific definition, but this is the regulatory definition that we're working with for our policy discussions today. And this is really comes from the Corps of Engineers Wetland Delineation Manual and lets us know that those regulated wetlands that we're talking about, whether they're federal or state, we define them typically with whether or not they have a inundated or saturated by surface or groundwater, whether or not that frequency is sufficient enough to support the prevalence of a vegetation that would be typical of life in that wet kind of environment, and then whether the soils are saturated. So that trifecta of environmental conditions you're going to hear a lot about today. Okay, here's a quick, really great graphic that IDEM has produced that helps remind us about a number of the things you may have heard about in the previous hour and 15 minutes or so. And that is just that we have a wide variety of wetland types, typed based on where they sit in the landscape and typed also by the kinds of vegetation that are in them. And then, of course, those things provide just a number of functions, and we've heard all about those really important functions, everything from wildlife breeding grounds to water quality to flood prevention and recreation and so on. So this graphic here, I'd like to just kind of point out to you, we might have these kinds of wetlands represented here with a shallow marsh with some open water pond that's not connected to a stream. We might have a lake or forested wetland with a forested wetland around the fringe of the lake that is connected to a downstream river. Or we might have something like this, which is a fen wetland that is fed by groundwater. And then eventually that groundwater connects to a tributary system. So those are just a few examples about how these wetlands can lay out across the landscape. I think the really important point I want to point out as we start to look at the different ways that these types are regulated and mitigated, that the functions are applicable to all of them. So whether it's state regulated or federal regulated, you can see that those icons are applied to every one of those types of wetlands. Okay, let's take a quick look. Virtual tour if you missed the earlier part to show you some of the diversity of the wetland areas we're talking about in regard to regulation. So they can be in a park-like setting, flat woods, edge of farm fields, roadside ditches. They can often be seen with standing water in them or sometimes trash in them because people have maybe don't have the same appreciation for wetlands as they should. So they could be full of tires sometimes, still a wetland. They could be full of turtles, still a wetland. So these are some more pictures to give you a sense of the diversity. Okay, here's a picture to remind you that this in fact is not a wetland. So if we're talking as we go through here today about whether agricultural lands are regulated or not regulated for wetlands, let me just remind you that that vegetation criteria is really important to the definition. So if this thing is growing corn, this is not a wetland. Okay, wetland types. They have these three criteria that I mentioned to you: the hydrophytic vegetation, the dominance of plants such as cattails and swamp milkweed and such. Those soils, if you get really into this, you want to dig up some holes out there and take a look at the different colors of the soils. There's a whole chart to help us identify these. Those soil colors end up being formed because there's no oxygen in the soil, which is part of that really important role they play for water quality, processing of pollution and removal. The last one is hydrology. So if you're out there taking a look around wondering if this is a regulated resource, evidence of some kind of hydrology is also an important criteria of how we define wetlands. So this could be those watermarks on trees or drift lines or crayfish chimneys or those kinds of things. Okay, I'm setting the stage here for you guys so you can understand when we start to talk about impacts and permits and those kinds of things that we work really hard as scientists to identify boundaries for these wetlands using that scientific criteria that I was just mentioning to you. So all those plants have classifications, those soils have a color chart, and those hydrology indicators have a full suite of things that you can look through to help you understand if hydrology is present. So that gives us a sense of wetlands having boundaries. This becomes really important when we start to talk about permitting impacts to them. You want to know what the boundary of it is. And then, of course, that helps the regulators decide what type and how much mitigation for that impact might be necessary. So this process is called wetland delineation, and it is cornerstone to a lot of the things we're going to talk about today. Identifying first, in fact, we have a wetland, and then what the boundaries of that wetland are. Okay, next up in your quick and dirty primer here is to help you understand where the regulatory jurisdiction comes from. And so primarily, the first and foremost place that we look at how wetlands are regulated is in reference to the Clean Water Act, which had told us that we want to maintain and restore the biological, chemical, and physical functions of our nation's waters. Those nation's waters are called waters of the US, or WOTUS. So you guys probably are familiar with all those WOTUS, FLOTUS, all those things. All right, so here's a graphic to show you what we mean by that. So the Clean Water Act and the jurisdiction of our federal government regarding these waters of the US was given over to the US Army Corps of Engineers. So that's the federal agency that has authority over waters of the US. And the ones that you're seeing here shown in the light green are wetlands, are connected to waters of the US and are waters of the US. Now, sometimes, as you saw our previous speakers talk about, some of our isolated wetlands, it may be connected to groundwater, but they may not have a direct surface water connection, hence the reason some people call them isolated. So that's what we have in terms of the lineup of the two kinds of wetlands we're talking about today. And when Indiana takes a look at the wetlands that then the federal government says that they are not going to regulate, Indiana says, well, hey, those other wetlands we just looked at are still really important. They're providing all the same functions and we need to protect them as a state. So Indiana has a program that protects isolated wetlands, which is what Senate Bill 389 is looking to deregulate. So let's talk about these very quickly. They come in classes. So this is actually not ordered wrong. We have class 1 wetlands at the state level that are defined by having some sort of disturbance or maybe low species diversity. Then we have on the flip side of that, the class 3 wetlands that are undisturbed and high quality and maybe even include some rare and ecologically important kinds of wetlands. So then what we have is the middle group between those that might have some disturbance, but might have some good habitat value. And so those are our class 2 wetlands. Okay, why is this all important? Well, as I mentioned, that means we have two very distinct authorities that are governing wetlands. And that's what we're going to try to show you how that all works today. All right, so wetlands regulation. If the Corps of Engineers says, hey, this wetland looks like it's connected to this stream, we're going to take jurisdiction. They call it a waters of the US. It is regulated by the Clean Water Act. And there's a permit process that involves both the Corps of Engineers and IDEM, the Indiana Department of Environmental Management. Okay, IDEM is involved in that side because they're sort of their state arm helping them work the process here in Indiana, but they are federally jurisdictional wetlands. On the other side of this flow chart, we have the isolated wetlands that are waters of the state, not waters of the US. They are governed by the Indiana Isolated Wetlands Law. So if you don't like the word isolated, take it up with the people that wrote the law. Okay, they then have an isolated wetland permit at IDEM that's managed at the state level. This generates then, for those of you interested in learning more, a couple of different sets of authorities that you would talk to based on the kind of wetland that you were interested in either having an impact on or studying or just wanting to know more about. So the Corps of Engineers has 3 different districts in our state, and they have project managers, and our state wetland staff at IDEM has different districts in the state, and they have different project managers. They made this really cool tool a couple of years ago that helps you, if this seems confusing to you about who's in charge of what and how to figure it all out. There's a great tool here at this website that has some written instructions, some video instructions, and will help you sort out who's in charge of what. So I'd really encourage you to use this tool and look at it if you need more help. Okay, so I only have a couple minutes. I want to tell you how this goes in terms of the numbers and why we're talking about this today. So the researchers explained to you the loss of wetlands we've had historically in this state is pretty significant. Leaves us with about 15% or about 850,000 acres left. Currently, under the federal rules that are in place regarding waters of the US, that means about 80 or 90% of the wetlands are isolated based on the current rule. And that gives us about 700,000 acres that would be impacted by Senate Bill 389. Now, I'm going to give you one more piece of this puzzle before I let you guys go here. And that is, of course, we've heard a lot of testimony in regard to this legislation about there being federal protections and that being enough. And that sometimes those federal protections change based on administration. So under the Obama era rule and the way they interpreted waters of the US, we had about 40% of our isolated wetlands protected. So currently, if we deregulate isolated wetlands, it's a much bigger impact than it would have been before. You might ask why this is possible. How can the same wetland be deregulated differently from president to president? Just going to remind you guys here of a couple last thoughts as Summer's going to show you an example that I think will drive some of this stuff home for you. But a reminder that the waters of the US is regulated by the Federal Clean Water Act. They set up these definitions and then they charge their agencies to interpret these rules. So the interpretation is where this gets really dicey sometimes. So let me share with you just briefly the latest status and why those numbers may change. So currently, recently there was a change in this interpretation of waters of the US, and that's that swinging pendulum I mentioned to you. So they repealed some definitions that were used in 2015, changed them in their interpretation, and then therefore that creates a difference between what's regulated at the federal level and the state level. The piece of this puzzle that's the most important to remember is that it all depends on that surface water connection we were talking about earlier. So if the stream is flowing year round and the wetland is attached to it, it's federally jurisdictional. If that stream is intermittent and it flows at different times of the year, but it flows even when there may not be a response to precipitation, it may be groundwater surfacing, then it is a jurisdictional waters of the US. The last one, the ephemeral one, is where we start splitting hairs between how each presidential administration may interpret this one. So if there's an ephemeral connection, one where water flows in pools due to precipitation, and if that is the flow path that connects the wetland, is that wetland federal or state? And that is up to interpretation. And so that's where we see that swinging pendulum. So these are the kinds of landscapes that leave us with those questions. Are these types of features connecting a wetland to a waters of the US, or is this connection too temporary in the mind of a current administration to call it a waters of the US? I'm teeing you up here to let my colleague Summer talk to you about, no matter what, if it's federally regulated or state regulated, and you want to impact it for development or a road project, we have a process for this. And this is the process that's being looked at through the Senate bill proposal. So we tell you first to avoid these impacts. Then we tell you if you're going to have an impact of more than 1/10 of an acre, you should mitigate or make up that impact. And then mitigate that based on the type of wetland you impacted and where you're doing that mitigation. This can get a little bit complicated in how you do the mitigation, and I will assume that we can handle this with conversation with our 2 agency representatives today. We have options for you to mitigate those impacts, which include mitigation banks, something called the in lieu fee program, and something called a permittee responsible mitigation. Summer's going to show you an example of the last one. Okay, so with that in mind, let's look at a project example, because I think that will, her showing you some things on the landscape will help you understand when a wetland might toggle between federally jurisdictional and state regulated. So with that, I would like to introduce my friend and colleague, who is a professional wetland scientist with more than 20 years of experience in the consulting industry. Summer Elmore works for CHA Consulting, which is a full service engineering firm with an office in Indianapolis. And she works on several different types of development projects, including a number of projects for our state through our Indiana Department of Transportation. So I would like to welcome Summer Elmore to share her screen and take us through a project example that makes this less than muddy.
Oh boy. I just gotta pick which screen I need to be grabbing here. Screen 2, there we go. Oh, I am not muted. All right. Accomplishment number 2. Hi, everybody. Thanks for attending this presentation today. We're happy here to just try to explain some of the concepts behind wetlands.
What? That screen was better.
I would like to take the next 15 minutes or so to walk you through an example project to show how a wetland permitting process works to protect wetland loss and to show how the terms you have heard earlier are applied. Here we go. Project I am sharing is called the 7th Road Extension. Is located in Marshall County, Indiana. CHA's role in this project as part of a larger team began in 2010. Project was needed because the new US 31 highway upgrade to a limited access highway severed many of the connections to important services in Plymouth. 7th Road would reestablish an east-west corridor at the new 7th Road interchange. Project is 3.9 miles long and we require 140 acres of right-of-way to be purchased. Cost of that construction was estimated to be over $14 million. Part of the process of most projects is the consideration of alternatives to find the solution for a problem that is most efficient and effective. Although we will focus on wetlands in this presentation, there are many reasons to consider alternatives such as construction costs, access to infrastructure, historic properties, traffic patterns, and safety. This map shows NWI wetlands in blue. And here, which stands for National Wetland Inventory, which is a GIS layer often used early to assess a project's potential wetland impacts. However, this NWI GIS layer does not show regulatory boundaries of wetlands, and they have to be field verified by a wetland professional. So you can see here as they're looking at alignments that they shift alignment to avoid impacting large wetland areas. As a project progresses, a wetland delineation must be conducted. A wetland delineations where wetland boundaries are identified and mapped using a field investigation using the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers protocols. So on this project, 18 wetlands totaling 10.35 acres were identified. You can see them called out here on the screen with the WL 3A, WL 5C. And we'll continue to look at this image as we move along. In a wetland delineation, a wetland scientist looks at the vegetation, soil, and hydrology indicators to determine the wetland boundary. A wetland data point and an upland data point are recorded on forms for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers guidance manuals. A wetland report is prepared that summarizes the findings of the investigation, and this report is submitted to the Corps for verification and determination of its jurisdictional status. It is the Corps' responsibility to formally determine federal jurisdiction. So you can see here in these tables that those wetlands that were found are just listed in table format. We include the wetland types, which include forested wetlands, shrub wetlands, and emergent wetlands, which are wetlands with no trees and shrubs. And these are just the initial ways we identify the different types of wetlands. All right, so this map we saw earlier, it's been updated to show which wetlands are federally jurisdictional in yellow and isolated or excluded wetlands in blue. So you can see, it looks like half of those, half and half there. So here's a closer look at the delineated wetland boundaries shown in yellow. And you can also see the NWI map shown in this blue crosshatch. So we note WL2B here and 2C in the center, these wetlands were delineated right along the stream. And so those are federally jurisdictional because they touch that stream directly. On the other hand, this WL2A here on the right, this wetland's not federally jurisdictional because it does not directly touch a stream. After the jurisdictional determination is made, wetland functional assessments are completed. Both functional assessments shown here, the Isolated Wetland Classification Worksheet and the Indiana Wetland Rapid Assessment Protocol, consider hydrology functions such as flood storage, water quality protection, and habitat functions such as plant diversity, hydrology depth, surrounding land use, wildlife corridor connectivity, and the presence of endangered species. So Jill mentioned earlier, these classes, class 1, 2, and 3, based on level of disturbance and those functions. Then this wetland shape files are overlaid on your project design plans to measure the wetland impact area. Here, WL2A is showing an impact of 0.64 acres of the 1.5 acre total. This information is entered on the permit applications. So here are the summary tables for wetland impacts. So we essentially took the same tables that we had in the wetland delineation report, and then which include the wetland identification, the wetland type, PFO, which is forested, PEM, which is not forested, the wetland size, the impact areas, and I've skipped ahead a little bit. So on the left and the right, on the right here is your tables of federally jurisdictional wetland impacts, which are permitted through section 4.1, which is administered by item, and section 404, which is administered by the Corps. And then this one on the left here is the remaining wetlands that would be permitted through the state isolated wetland law. So one of the things I just wanted to point out here is your project impacts are less than their wetland size that were found. And so you have your total wetland impact here, 2.3 acres out of the 8.55 acres that were delineated. This is due to additional refinement of the preferred route to avoid and minimize impacts to the delineated wetlands. This effort not only saves in mitigation obligations, but also reduces the amount of fill needed to construct the roadway, soil treatments to ensure proper subgrade, drainage structures, and other engineering considerations due to organic or saturated soils. So the next part of this formula here is once we've determined all the wetland impact acres, we apply the mitigation ratios based on the wetland type to be impacted. So in this scenario, we have our forested wetlands. They're mitigated at a higher ratio than the other types of wetlands. And that's because it takes a lot longer and a lot more effort to create forested wetlands, or for the function of forested wetlands to be restored to the full extent. And so these ratios kind of make up for some of that temporal loss that is encountered when doing mitigation. So as we noted, the mitigation is required when the project's impacts exceed 1/10 of an acre of wetland impact. And so our total here, we've got for the project, 4.6 acres of mitigation required for the federally jurisdictional wetlands and 1.07 acre of mitigation required for our isolated wetlands. We'll just touch on the mitigation process briefly. At the time of this project, the in-lieu fee program was not yet available for mitigation credits, and no mitigation banks were available. So the mitigation had to be completed with the project by the applicant. Permittee responsible to mitigation includes mitigation site search for the 5.67 acres, purchase of the mitigation property, mitigation plan and design, construction of the mitigation, monitoring of the mitigation, maintenance, and conservation easement. So the 7th Road mitigation site was obtained adjacent to the project on the east end from a willing seller of 22 acres. The land was active pasture adjacent to Zimmer Ditch. It's over here. Okay. Mitigation concept was to grade the site to expand the existing wetland areas in zigzag hatch on site, and the adjacent Zimmer Ditch would be modified to flood the wetland mitigation. Water budget is analyzed to inform the choice of plants to be installed based on the frequency, depth, and duration of flooding. Mitigation site shown here was a pasture, so was low diversity of plants, providing minimal wildlife value. And if there's time, we'll come back to this at the end. So now we're going to talk about some of the recent changes in federal jurisdiction definitions. The most recent federal change was the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, which became effective in June 2020. Notice this grouping of forested wetlands on the east end of the project, currently shown as federally jurisdictional in yellow. These were connected to nearby streams through buried drainage tile, which is observed at a tile blowout within the wetland. So you note the watermarks on the trees within the forested wetland, indicating the depth of water stored here during part of the year. So let's take a look at how the jurisdiction would look if this was permitted today, as opposed to 2013. If this project were to be permitted today, wetlands 9A, 9D, 9E, 10B, 10C would all be considered isolated under the new navigable waters protection rule, because they were only connected by a subsurface drain tile. Surface water connection is now required. Therefore, the mitigation required for WL 9A would be conducted under isolated wetland regulations, which requires a ratio of 2.5 to 1 instead of 4 to 1. I'll show that on the next page. So now let's take a look at how the loss of the state isolated wetland law would affect this project. The table here shows wetlands that would lose protection, plus the WL9A noted from the last slide. So just because these wetlands do not meet the current definition of federal jurisdiction doesn't mean that they do not have crucial functions within the watershed. The definition of federal jurisdiction is political, which varies with each administration. The isolated wetland law provides a much needed consistency to Indiana permitting, as the federal definition changes every few years. I just wanted to take a few minutes to just highlight some of the changes since that project was permitted in 2013. The in lieu fee program has come online, and that gives the permittee an option to pay for their mitigation with just a one-time check, and they just pay that fee, and then their mitigation obligation is complete. So this typically, for the most time, costs much less, results in faster permit application prep and review time, and is much easier. Jill also showed us that Waterways inquiry request, which is a tool to help citizens determine if they need a permit to complete a project. And that tool is evolved to help everybody learn when they need to do a permit or not. And I believe on its way is a single application form that would be submitted to a single email address, where you can take care of all your permit needs in that one application and receive your responses from all the agencies through that one avenue. So keep your eye out for that. I hear it's on the way. And oh, look, I have a minute left. So lastly, I just wanted to revisit that wetland mitigation site construction, just to nail down how great that in lieu fee program is. So we're just showing here the construction of the mitigation site, and it costs nearly $400,000 to build, but you did get 4.5 acres of wetland creation, 3 acres of wetland enhancement, 3.62 acres of stream buffer, 5 acres of prairie buffer, and 3 acres of upland forest preservation out of that project. And the monitoring is currently in its 7th year. And so monitoring has to be conducted annually, and invasive species need to be treated, and tree survival, if you have forested wetland component, have to measure the tree survival of your plantings. And if they don't meet, they need to be replanted. So I think it's just helpful to show that in lieu fee can save quite a bit of time and trouble for the average applicant. I believe at this point I get to turn this over and give Indra an opportunity to.
I actually think, Summer, I'm going to jump in and introduce our regulators now so they can react to your awesome project example. It's better to see those than I could possibly explain those intermittent connections. So I really appreciate you talking about what ones would come in and out as that pendulum swings between how we interpret surface water connections. So okay, with that, I want to invite our next couple of speakers to join this conversation that might help all of us provide some clarity on how our agencies engage in these kinds of projects. First up, Andrew Blackburn has been a regulatory specialist with the Chicago district of the Army Corps. So if you guys remember, I showed you those project maps. We have different districts. He's been there over 11 years. Prior to working for the Corps, he worked for a natural resource consulting firm in the private sector for 9 years, similar to what Summer does. He's on the Indiana Permits and Enforcement section for the LRC, which covers Lake, Porter, and portions of LaPorte counties in Indiana. He also serves as the interagency review team for the LRC, which reviews proposed mitigation banks and in lieu fee programs, both in Illinois and Indiana. So Summer mentioned the advent of the in lieu fee program, which the Corps oversees, and he can talk to us about how that works if the permittee is not going to do mitigation on site and rather pay into a system that the state manages. So also joining us for a conversation is Brian Wolf. He is the branch chief of the surface water and operations in the Office of Water Quality at IDEM. Brian has been in the Office of Water Quality for the past 6 years, but has been part of IDEM staff for over 20 years. These guys bring a great perspective and can hopefully answer questions as we go through. So I'd like to just ask those two if they would unmute as well. We're going to set this up as a conversation. So these guys are not sharing any slides. If we need slides, we can go back to one of our presentations. So I guess I'd like to start with you, Andrew. Do you want to just hop off and say hello? And I'd like to just ask if you could share any reactions to that project example that Summer shared, and kind of tell us how projects like that, how you get involved in projects like that, and how important that jurisdictional determination is, first from you guys.
Sure. Hopefully everybody can hear me. Good afternoon. And what I'm going to do is touch on the Navigable Waters Protection Rule and give kind of a brief overview on that for everybody. So as it's been mentioned a few times already in the presentation, there's a new rule that's been in effect since June of 2020. So less than a year. So a lot of us in the regulatory world are still working it out, or it's fairly new in that aspect. So under this Navigable Water Protection Rule, there's 4 main categories of wetlands and waters that are going to be subject to federal regulation under the Clean Water Act. And the first of those is territorial seas like the Atlantic Ocean, Pacific Ocean, and then traditional navigable waters. For example, in Indiana, the St. Joe River and the Ohio River are considered navigable throughout their entire extent, as well as Lake Michigan. So the second category of water that's subject to federal regulation is tributaries to traditional navigable waters. In other words, perennial and intermittent streams. Examples of these are Fall Creek, that's in the Indianapolis area, Potato Creek up north, and Wildcat Creek, which is not too far from, Lafayette, runs close to Lafayette, starts somewhere around Kokomo. And then the third category is lakes and ponds. So lakes, ponds, and impoundments of jurisdictional waters, such as Geist Reservoir or Dean Lake, are jurisdictional or will be considered jurisdictional where they contribute surface water flow to a traditional navigable water or territorial sea in a typical year, either directly or indirectly. So a lot of words there, but and then the fourth and very important, lastly but not least, I'll say fourth category is wetlands that are adjacent to or abut is another, the more current term for adjacency. So wetlands adjacent to waters, the 3 above waters that I just mentioned: traditional navigable waters, tributaries that drain into those traditional navigable waters, and then lakes and ponds. So for wetlands and waters, that are going to be regulated under the NWPR, and what the Navigable Water Protection Rule also does is it specifically excludes 12 types of wetlands and waters, and most notably those some of those have been touched upon. Ephemeral drainage features or seasonal waterways are no longer regulated. Groundwater, including groundwater fed wetlands with no surface water flow, some ditches, and stormwater control structures constructed in uplands. They've basically clarified a lot, and it's, I guess generally you could say it's a more narrow interpretation, but so that's just a brief overview. I don't know if I've run out of time, but I just wanted to kind of hit on that because that's what I'm at. The Corps of Engineers is in charge of administering or making those calls.
So thank you, Andrew. So just to clear it up, the latest change, that pendulum swinging that was enacted, lessened the number of wetlands that you regulated in Indiana, right?
I would say, I mean, I don't have numbers, but just based on the fact that the exclusions include areas that were previously regulated, I guess I could, jump to that conclusion.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, it's okay. We have those numbers for you. So, we're trying to reduce the jargon a little bit. So when he says NWPR, he means the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, which is the Trump era interpretation of waters of the US. So sometimes it helps us less jargony folks to think about what administration is interpreting this, and their administration of waters of the US was much narrower, which would lessen the number of wetlands the federal authorities like yourselves have in the state. So with that clarity, which I hope you guys are all following this, we would like to invite Brian Wolf to hop on here, and just Brian, if you could kind of talk a little bit about how things have changed since that shift in interpretation at the federal level, and how maybe why having a state wetlands program allows us to kind of buffer that swinging pendulum a little bit. How does that help us know that these things are still regulated by someone? Can you talk a little bit about your role?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. So the state isolated wetland law does help kind of provide a little bit of certainty as far as if it's a wetland, they know they need to get in contact with somebody to see how it is regulated. There are 12 other states out there that have a similar program, and the states that don't have those programs are talking about the difficulties that the public has in trying to understand when something is or isn't permitted. This is a unique permitting program. There's not really another permitting program like this in the state because we deal with a wide range of permittees. It could be someone that's like a road project like Summer did, that hires a professional that understands what's going on. And it could be a farmer, or it could be, a coal mine. I mean, there's a very wide range of people that would be impacted by this type of regulation. And so having some certainty in that you need to contact somebody when you touch a wetland definitely helps. So.
To that end, can you talk a little bit about how that tool that we've pointed out and this new single form, why that has evolved, and as you're dealing with all these different stakeholders, how does something like that help?
Yeah, I mean, I think something that people forget about is really this isolated wetland law has only been in place since really 2005. So it's not like it's this mature program that's been since the Clean Water Act was enacted in the 70s. So we are trying to grow and adjust as we move through this process. And so we've kind of listened to the stakeholders, listened to the frustrations they had, because this is very complicated. There's a wide range of different type of permitting structures that you could go under the federal or the state. So we're trying to simplify that a little bit. One is we have that new Waterways tool where you can get online. It's a very easy system. You can highlight an area on a map, you put in the basic things of what you want to do for your project, and then you submit it, and both IDEM and DNR will give you an official evaluation as to if a permit is needed and if or not, and then a general idea what type of permit you would probably need. And then the other thing that we have coming down the pipe too is right now we have multiple forms that you can fill out, and that's confusing for people. Again, we have a wide range of people that use this program. So we're going to try to simplify it. So we're providing one form. You put the information that you have, the information on the form, and then you submit it to us. And then it'll go to DNR, it'll come to us, and it also count as for Army Corps. Army Corps will also agree to use the same application for their permitting program as well. So hopefully that'll make things a little bit simpler for people. The number one thing that we get is people not providing enough information. That's usually what slows down the process.
Okay, speaking of that, I'm just looking at a couple of questions I'm hoping you can answer for us. Some questions in the chat about mitigation. So Summer mentioned the in lieu fee program is new. And so there's some questions about what is the mitigation fee and when is it, how is it chosen? So a little bit in your permit process, when do you decide what type of mitigation a permittee can do or would do? And then there was another question sort of related is who's paying for the monitoring and maintenance cost, whether that be if a permittee does that wetland mitigation, it's permittee driven, or they instead go to in lieu fee or a bank who does the monitoring and maintenance in each of those scenarios. How does that work?
So from the state perspective on the state impacts, we let the applicant choose what they want to do. So they can buy from a bank if there's a bank, they can do the in lieu fee, or they can build their own mitigation. We don't have a set criteria as to a hierarchy as to what we prefer. If they buy from a bank or they buy from the in lieu fee program, they write a check and they're done, which is great because there's no liability there. If you have permittee responsible mitigation, you mentioned it, they would have to do the monitoring to ensure that that mitigation is actually meeting the mitigation criteria. So if they do their own mitigation, they would be responsible for paying for that monitoring. If they write the check to in lieu fee, DNR will be the one doing it. And if they buy from a bank, then the owner of the bank will be the one responsible for doing the monitoring.
Okay, I just want to clear this up for maybe people that aren't in our world. They're not just writing a check and it's going into the giant coffers at the state. Can you explain what happens to the money and how the mitigation gets done differently then, or where it shows up on the landscape?
Yeah, so this actually goes to DNR. So that's another misconception that IDEM is getting this money, and that is not the case. It all goes to DNR. And DNR is the one, what they're doing is they're taking this money and they're building larger scale wetlands. So they're kind of taking these little pockets, and one of the big advantages of this program is somebody may impact a half an acre or 1 acre of wetland. Trying to recreate that wetland and meet success criteria is really hard. So IDEM or DNR will pull all that together, and they'll make a larger wetland, a 30-acre wetland or a 100-acre wetland, which, going back to the scientists that presented earlier, it is a lot easier to sustain and has different ecological functions. So it's usually a net increase in the functions of the wetland that way.
Okay, that's great. Okay, thanks for clearing up some of that stuff. It seems like there's multiple permit pathways and multiple mitigation pathways. So we're just trying to help people kind of piece that stuff together. I'm going to turn this over to our other colleague, Indra Frank, where I think we're doing pretty okay on time. And Indra's going to talk to us a little bit about, what are some paths forward? So we've talked about, ways that you guys are trying to streamline process. But we know we're dealing with this swinging pendulum of interpretation at the federal level, and we know all the wetlands are important. So with those three things in mind, what might some of our solutions going forward look like, Indra, and what should we be thinking about in regards to Senate Bill 389?
Yeah, well, thank you, Jill, and thanks to everyone who's spoken today, and those of you who are out there this afternoon, listening to all these details on wetlands. My name is Indra Frank. I'm the Director of Environmental Health and Water Policy for the Hoosier Environmental Council. I'm going to go ahead and share a PowerPoint that I've got to wrap us up here. The Hoosier Environmental Council is a not-for-profit organization that's been working on healthy environment and sustainable economy for Indiana since 1983. And this afternoon, we have heard inspiring talks about the science and beauty and value of wetlands. We've heard about their critical role in the water resources of our state, the vital role they play for many species that rely on them. And now we've heard, sort of step by step, how the current wetlands law works to help protect wetlands in our state. And it protects them chiefly by making sure that if a development project has to impact a wetland, that wetland gets replaced through what's called mitigation. So what's before us now as a state is a policy decision. Are we going to continue to protect the state wetlands? And if so, how are we going to protect them? Just repeating some of what we heard earlier, since European settlement, Indiana has lost 85% of its original wetlands. And of the wetlands that remain, 10 to 20% are federally protected and 80 to 90% are state protected. And those numbers come from testimony that was provided by our state environmental agency. So as a state, it's up to us to decide what we're going to do with that 80 to 90%. Back in 2003, Indiana's legislature recognized the value of the remaining wetlands and wrote Indiana's wetlands law. And of course, as Brian mentioned, it got implemented in 2005. Just a month ago, this bill was introduced in the Indiana legislature that would repeal Indiana's wetlands law. The bill is known as Senate Bill 389 or SB 389. The Indiana Senate has already passed SB 389. So they have voted for a full repeal of state wetland protection. And the bill now goes to the House for consideration. A number of reasons have been put forward in favor of a repeal of Indiana's wetlands law. And I'd like to address some of the reasons that we've heard in discussion. One reason that's been given is that Indiana should not be more stringent than the federal government. This is essentially arguing that we should not protect any wetlands that are not federally protected. So some are federally protected, we should stop there, and the state shouldn't protect any additional wetlands. The counterpoint to that argument is that federal regulation was intentionally built to delegate responsibility to the state. If we are protecting the non-federal wetlands, we're simply taking responsibility for our own state resources. Another reason that has been given in favor of repeal is that federal wetlands are the important ones, so loss of the state regulated wetlands will not affect water quality or flooding. And of course, today we've heard in some depth those points clearly debunked. All wetlands have value and have important functions in the ecosystem and in our hydrologic system, our water system. Another reason that we've heard in favor of repealing the state wetland law is that wetland regulation hurts farmers. So this has come up a number of times, both in the Senate committee and in the Senate floor debate. However, there are specific exemptions in the wetland law, and I've actually put verbatim one of the exemptions from the law IC, which is Indiana Code 131822. There's a list of exceptions, and one of those exceptions is for normal farming, silviculture, and ranching activities, such as plowing, seeding, cultivating, minor drainage, and harvesting. And then the law goes on to a more detailed exemption for drainage. There's also an exemption for incidental wet spots that occur in farm fields. So it's hard to see how the law might actually be hurting farmers. But another way of looking at that is to what extent have farmers wound up in the wetland permitting process? Well, IDEM provided data from the last 4 years, and over that time, no farm was regulated under the state law such that it had to build, replacement wetlands or do wetland mitigation. And over those same 4 years, farms were only responsible for a total of 4.39 acres of wetland mitigation for federal wetlands. So even if all wetlands in the state were regulated under our state law, it would be on average only an acre per year of wetland mitigation from our agricultural property owners. Another reason that we've heard in favor of repeal is that wetland regulation increases the cost of housing. And the counterpoint to that is that in the last 4 years, on average, there have been seven housing development projects per year that did mitigation for state wetlands. And there were only 6 housing development projects per year that had to do mitigation for federal wetlands. So on average, there are about 13 housing development projects per year that have either state wetland or federal wetland impacts. And it's hard to imagine that only 13 projects per year would actually have an impact on the state's entire cost of housing. And in fact, this headline came up just a month ago in Inside Indiana Business that home construction permits have hit a 12-year high in central Indiana. It's kind of further debunking the notion that construction is being hurt by wetland regulation. And the final reason that I wanted to touch on that has been given in favor of repeal is that Indiana's wetlands law interferes with personal property rights. And I think that this, it may be the crux of the problem that's driving Senate Bill 389. This bill raises a very basic policy question. If I own property and there's a wetland on my property, why can't I do what I want with it? And I felt like it was important for us to address that point head on. The counterpoint to that is that wetlands are part of the water system, which is a shared resource. Like air is a shared resource. Water ignores property lines the same way air does. What one person does to one part of the water system on one property affects everyone else. And I'd like to show just one kind of simple example. So here's one example of how wetlands are a shared resource. According to the EPA, 1 acre of wetland can hold 1 to 1.5 million gallons of water. So if I have 1 acre of wetland on my property, and we'll say that, you know, these 2 wetlands here are mine and they add up to 1 acre, then that 1 acre of wetland, you know, during the wet part of the year could be holding 1 to 1.5 million gallons of water. If I decide to fill those wetlands, then during the next big storm, the 1 million gallons of water from that wetland will have to go somewhere else and it might flood my neighbor. Water ignores property lines and it's a common resource. So from a policy standpoint, it's a resource that we need to steward as a society. It's not something that we can do as individuals. The current debate, excuse me, is over the fate of the state wetlands law. And it will lead to one of several possible outcomes. One outcome is that if Senate Bill 389 passes, then our legislature will have decided that as a society, we do not need to protect the state wetlands. So if it passes, then 80 to 90% of the wetlands in Indiana that are the state wetlands could be destroyed at will. This will save money for individual developers, but as wetlands are destroyed, there will be a high cost to society in increased flooding, reduced groundwater recharge, reduced water quality, and loss of plant and animal species, as we heard, you know, so beautifully covered from 3 to 4 o'clock this afternoon. So that would be the path if Senate Bill 389 passes, but there are other options. One, of course, is over the next 6 to 8 weeks as the legislative session goes through its second half, 389 could pass the House, and that would mean a repeal of the Indiana wetlands law. 389 might be stopped. Maybe the members of the House don't decide they don't care for the bill, they vote against it. Or, you know, even if they pass it, I suppose it could get vetoed by the governor. So if that happens, if the bill is just plain stopped, we would keep our existing wetlands law. And finally, it's possible that Senate Bill 389 will get revised as it goes through the House. There has been frustration with complexity of the existing wetlands law, so it may be worth considering changes. And as Brian talked about, I mean, there have been changes since the law was first written in 2003. Like there have been changes in how many wetlands are federal versus state protected. The legislature added the in lieu fee process in 2015 to make wetland mitigation easier. And IDEM has been improving the permit process, and it sounds like more improvements are in the pike. And then as we heard from one of our research colleagues earlier, we're seeing an increase in the number of heavy storms, an increase overall in precipitation, and more of that precipitation is coming in extreme storms. So a number of ideas have come up for potentially revising the law and revising Senate Bill 389. It may be that Indiana's wetlands law could benefit from additional changes. There may be ways to reduce the complexity of the permit process. There may be ways to align it with the federal permit process such that that reduces complexity and simplifies things for those who have to apply for a wetland permit. And perhaps it'll be possible to create more incentives for property owners who preserve wetlands, and we can achieve more wetland preservation in that way. So if we're going to revise our wetlands law, it's worth doing so in a thoughtful and considered manner. We should examine what the state has learned over the last 18 years under the current law, and we should take time to look at how wetlands are protected in other states. According to the Environmental Law Institute, 23 states have permitting programs for some or all of their freshwater wetlands, although, yeah, as we've heard, the regulation in different states does vary. So one way we could look at revising our current wetlands law would be through one of the legislature's summer study committees that meet between legislative sessions, and another would be by creating a task force. It's honestly quite difficult to have an in-depth discussion during the legislative session. Our legislature is in session for only a few months of each year, and during that time they consider hundreds of bills on so many different topics. This screen grab from the legislative website has only a small fraction of the bills that were introduced this year. This particular legislative session is even more challenging, and that's because this is a budget writing year. And it's also because the legislature is addressing COVID issues. On top of that, COVID precautions are reducing the time available for committee meetings. And committee meetings are usually when the most in-depth discussions can happen during the legislative session. So a careful consideration of revisions to the wetlands law with everyone at the table could happen more effectively outside of the legislative session. Now, the Indiana Senate actually considered whether to send this issue of revising our wetlands law to a summer study committee. The Senate rejected that approach, but it could be revisited in the House. So at the moment, Senate Bill 389 is a full repeal of the state wetlands law, and it would leave 80 to 90% of our remaining wetlands in jeopardy. It could be amended as it goes through the House over the course of the next 6 or 7 weeks. There are many groups looking at options for changing the bill so that it revises the law instead of completely repealing it. And there are many groups that actually support taking this discussion outside of the legislative session where it can be more thorough. If you're interested in following this bill or any of the other environmental bills during the legislative session, the Hoosier Environmental Council keeps a Bill Watch 2021 website where you can see the updates. We also send out an email newsletter on a regular basis with updates. And of course, there are also updates on our social media. And I wanted to put in just a quick advocacy note. You know, I do work for an advocacy organization and encourage everyone to contact your legislator and tell them where you think Indiana should be when it comes to protecting our state wetlands. If you go to your internet browser and you search for Indiana Find My Legislator, you should get this website where you enter your street address, and then it will show you who your legislators are and how to contact them. Our legislators really need to hear from the voters and hear from their constituents about what they want for our state wetlands. And finally, this is Wetlands Action Week from February 21st through the 27th. Please, if you have photos, post your wetland photos with the hashtag Wetlands Action Week and tag your legislator. And with that, we can go to more questions. If we have more in the chat. Jill,
Indra, I've been trying to watch some of those coming in, at least in the chat here. I'm sure others are answering and responding on Slack. I'd first like thank the agency folks who are answering people's questions live and in person. Thank you for doing that. There were some questions about like the number of complaints, and I think you gave us a sense of the number of permits. So I don't know if Brian wants to sort of address any sense of how and if there's a complaint process. And then also, Indra, then back to you after that about the likelihood of this bill passing in your opinion. Just some curiosity about any sense of that. So Brian?
Yeah, sure. We receive somewhere between 200 to 250 complaints per year concerning the filling of wetlands. We receive other complaints for flooding as well that usually we know they're indirectly related, but we don't necessarily have a direct correlation to those. We do find a number of permit violations where we have to have people go back through and go through the permitting process after that we found those.
So you're saying the public calls you and can turn in concerns or complaints from activities they think are impacting them. Is that right?
That is correct. Yeah,
okay.
That's correct.
Okay, great. Indra, can we hop back to you? Do you have a sense of the likelihood of the bill passing as is? Is there any read on that?
Well, yeah, there are, I know a lot of conversations going around. We've had a number of legislators, both in the Senate and in the House, talk about changing the bill instead of leaving it as a full repeal. We have not seen a proposal for such a change yet, but the bill is only just starting on its path into the House. So the bills that pass the Senate will start the process in the House Monday. For the second half of the legislative session. This is a tough one, and I think it's one of the toughest environmental bills I've seen in my 7 legislative sessions. And it was unfortunate to see it pass the Senate as a full repeal. I mean, each of the senators who voted for it voted to repeal Indiana's wetlands law. It did not pass with, any kind of unanimity. There were 19 votes against it, 29 votes for it, and among the 19, both parties were represented. So we'll see.
Okay, can you speak to, there's a question here about what data or facts have the senators and House representatives been provided for consideration of this bill? Can you tell us a little bit about if what kinds of data show up with a bill like this, or is this really just one person's idea?
This bill occurred as a bit of a shock and a surprise. I don't think, there certainly was a cadre of legislators who discussed it and wrote it leading up to the legislative session. But amongst all of the wetland professionals that I've talked to and the agencies, this bill came as a surprise. Once it was introduced, there was a single committee hearing that ran 2 hours and 20 minutes. Out of that, there were only 2 people who got to testify in opposition, and that was the state agencies and then one, I believe, wetland consultant. There were a number of other people who sent in testimony in opposition, and there were 8 groups that were there to testify in opposition that didn't get to, just because of how that committee hearing went. I mean, a lot of information has been sent to legislators, but like I said, they're very busy during the legislative session with only a finite amount of opportunity to dig into the details and the data on any given topic.
So no report that would summarize the acreage taken out of authority has been provided, or the amount of flood mitigation that would be lost. None of those numbers have been drafted in a report of any sort.
No, not that I'm aware of. I mean, there
Okay.
was testimony about on those points from the agency personnel.
Okay.
But yeah.
Okay, some more questions. I love the reference to the Schoolhouse Rocks memories. Thank you for that, Jana, about how this all works. But people are acknowledging that the governor's office has expressed some concerns about it and wondering if there's any chatter in that direction, and some others reminding us that a simple majority vote could override that. If that was, can you just, any more updates on that front?
You know, that is absolutely the case. The governor made comments in the press that he is concerned about what we would lose if Senate Bill 389 went through as is. We haven't had any assurances, but there could be a veto. And unfortunately, what's in the chat is correct. In Indiana, a simple majority could overturn a veto. We've already seen that this year. And if the governor were to veto Senate Bill 389, the veto could be overturned next year.
Okay, thanks for helping us understand how important it is for us to act on this bill. There was a question about whether the bill distinguishes between classes of wetlands or if it does deregulate all isolated wetlands. I believe you've answered that with the latter being true. Scrolling through some of these other questions in here. Let's see. Let me see if there's anything I missed. Folks suggesting that this recording maybe be sent to some of our legislators as a way to get kind of a handle on how it works if they don't know. So we can certainly look into that. It's a good idea. I wanted to just acknowledge there was a comment and a shout out to our Indiana Wetlands program for the consistency it provides from a consultant who says she works in Illinois and Indiana. Says it's far less complicated than the dozens of ordinances that change per municipality or county level in Illinois. So I guess from a policy discussion, if these things become deregulated, it looks like other states have answered them with local regulations, which would potentially provide, according to this comment from a consultant, a lot more inconsistency and complexity municipality to municipality. So
Yeah.
I just appreciate that perspective being shared in the chat as well. Okay, someone else, if they're watching and I'm skipping some stuff here, please forgive me. We're scrolling through both chat and Slack. It's a double duty today. Andrew or Brian, have you seen any other comments that you feel like you could answer or address or want to provide any clarity to these last bits about local regulation? Anything from you guys?
I can speak to the Illinois side, and yes, there are some counties in our district that have stormwater ordinances that also have wetland and stream setbacks. But you know, that's there's really only 2 counties that have those and actually enforce it. So I mean, yeah, that could happen in Indiana, but I would say it's pretty doubtful unless you're talking about counties with big population centers like Indianapolis, Hamilton County, and you know, maybe Lake County, Porter County. But yeah, so that's I don't think that's, you know, and that's not what the commenter was trying to say. I don't think that's an acceptable substitute. I just, you know, I don't think people should count on that basically in lieu of the state isolated law.
Okay, thank you for that perspective. Brian, did you have anything you wanted to add in regard to more local control or anything that I missed in the chat?
Yeah, no, that would be difficult for us to answer at a state level. I do know there's a number of river basin groups out there, though, that do have some level, like the Kankakee agency. And I'm not sure what their role or what their how they would react to that type of situation.
Okay. There was another question about the organizations that are behind this bill, and it looks like you guys are answering each other's questions in regard to some of that stuff. So I just encourage you to kind of scroll through that chat. Obviously, a strong lobby from the Indiana Builders Association and Farm Bureau also stood up in support as well. So I'm hoping I've covered it all. Maybe Indra, have you been panning around here? Anybody else want to jump in with anything I've missed? If not, I guess I would just add, this is sure a complicated topic, but that said, I think we systematically work through it in a really strong way here at the state. The tools help. The inconsistencies or swinging pendulum at the federal level is buffered by our state program. And so I can tell you, as a multi-county nonprofit working on water quality and quantity management, we deeply appreciate having those resources protected at the state level. So we'll continue to host conversations and try to work toward policy solutions, and just really encourage you to follow Indra's slides and her links to contact your legislators. Which is certainly the most pivotal and potentially devastating piece of legislation we've seen in regard to wetland management. So the time to pay attention is now. If you have further questions about process or permitting, I think any one of us would be happy to talk with you more about that. So with that, I'd kind of like to just thank all of our presenters that did a great job of trying to sort out the realities of wetland impacts and permits, and encourage you to just stay involved with Wetlands Action Week, post your favorite wetlands, call your legislators, and let us know how we can help. I think there was some comments about sharing slides. We'll see what we can do about that. Indra, anything else before we go?
Yeah, no, thank you all for being with us this afternoon. I'll be posting my slides on the Hoosier Environmental Council's Bill Watch page, and we will be posting the recording of the policy forum.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks you for your concern and passion and leadership on wetlands, and we will see you soon.
Thank you.